Hello and welcome to this edition of Wineskins, a program that features reflections on the lives of the saints and sacred scriptures, along with information on topics and issues from a Catholic perspective. I'm Father Jim Korda. Wineskins is brought to you by the Annual Bishop's Appeal, the Catholic Communication Campaign, and St. Paul's Catholic Books and Gifts, a division of the Society of St. Paul. On our show today, I will speak with Father Jeff Mickler on the Vatican II document on religious life. We will also look at the life of St. Agatha, as well as reflections on the readings for this feast of the Presentation of the Lord. That and more coming up on Wineskins. In our current issue, I will speak with Dr. Shannon Dee Williams on religious life. With me again is Dr. Shannon Dee Williams, who is the Assistant Professor of History at Villanova in Pennsylvania. Welcome back to Wineskins.
Thank you for having me again.
Last time you were here, you gave a presentation at our First Friday Club, a great one on the Real Sister Act. I'd like to kind of continue our conversation now. We talked about vocations among African Americans, religious life, priesthood, and there are very few here in our own diocese. What are some of the vocations around the country that you know of that need to be lifted up and celebrated as part of that great history?
Well, certainly, when we begin to tell the stories of Black Catholic sisters, what we begin to recognize is how committed, how faithful, how devout so many of these young women and girls were when they decided to pursue their vocations. Oftentimes, young women had to travel hundreds and even thousands of miles away from their hometowns to be able to answer God's call on their lives. You know, one example from Ohio that I often like to tell is the story of the Thomas family from Akron, Ohio. They have roots in Catholic Kentucky. They were sort of devout families, African Americans who have been Catholic for quite some time. They migrated to Ohio in the early 20th century as a part of the Great Migration, and all of their children were educated in Catholic schools in Akron. 4 of their daughters all became sisters. The oldest 3 became members of the Franciscan Handmaids of the Most Pure Heart of Mary in Harlem. That community was actually established in Savannah, Georgia in 1916, and then they were forced to relocate to Harlem in 1923 as a result of sort of hostility towards them as African American women religious. And so the oldest 3 sisters go into the handmaids. The youngest sister, Josephine, actually desegregates the Sisters of St. Joseph of St. Mark in Cleveland. And I like to tell that story because it reminds us of that long tradition of Catholicism that has survived. We'll certainly see that in places like Ohio because it received large numbers of Black Catholics who had migrated from the Kentucky area. But I think those stories are important because it reminds us that African Americans were always fighting to make their church as Catholic as it possibly could, to make sure that it could live up to its ideals. And those stories reveal that to us.
And I think part of the story, unfortunately, part of the continued story is the sin of racism, which we continue to battle, it seems, daily. Why, as Catholics, why, as people of faith, why is it important for us to address that in what we say and how we live and how we treat people?
I think it is essential because the Catholic Church, unfortunately, is deeply implicated in this history, not only with this practice of slavery, but also of segregation as well. But I also know that we have a tradition of understanding that the Catholic Church could also break those lines at every turn. African American Catholics used to say the Catholic Church alone can break the color line because of its social teachings, because of its embrace of universal humanity and universal brotherhood. And so I think so much of the story of African American Catholics is not simply sort of that painful history of experiencing racism, but also that deep faithfulness in the ability of the church to do what it says and to be what it says it is. And I think those are the kinds of stories, and to remind us that the church has at this moment also has this tradition of fighting it very beautifully as well, that unfortunately many of us don't know.
I think one thing that struck me as you were talking is that there's a sense when people of faith can work together, truly work together, if they're truly people of faith, then great things can happen.
Absolutely.
And so what are some of those great things in your work in history that you would like to lift up?
You know, one great example begins to occur right after World War I when state laws began to change, requiring private school teachers to accredit their schools. That meant they had to get a normal certificate or at least get a bachelor's degree. And so that changes for the church. That's a situation that all sisters have to sort of begin to confront. The challenge, of course, for the nation's Black sisterhoods is that at that time, most Catholic colleges and universities did not accept African Americans, whether or not they were Catholic or not. And so what begins to happen is that the Black leadership councils begin to contact the Vatican, and the Vatican sends in officials to begin to identify who they believe to be white Catholics who are progressive on those matters. And then we begin to see wonderful stories. One story that I always like to tell is the story of the Sisters of Charity of Greensburg, Pennsylvania. For over 20 years, they quietly went to the South to run a normal school for the Sisters of the Holy Family. They didn't sort of tell anybody what they were doing. They worked with Loyola initially and then later Xavier University to ensure that the Sisters of the Holy Family would be able to accredit their schools throughout Louisiana. It's an example of an early sort of this freedom summers that we tend to associate with the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. And we recognize that the Catholic Church was doing that in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And so I think when we begin to tell Black Catholic stories and tell Black sister stories in particular, we see these moments of great visionary leadership that unfortunately have been pushed to the margins of history at this point.
Well, Dr. Williams, thank you for lifting those up and for your presence again here on Wineskins. We wish you well in your endeavors and also in sharing that rich history with us, not only as Catholics, but people of faith. And so we thank you for that.
Thank you again for having me.
For Wineskins, I'm Father Jim Korda. This coming Wednesday, the church celebrates the feast of St. Agatha. To tell us more is Lou Jacquet. He is from St. Brendan Church in Youngstown.
Agatha suffered martyrdom in Sicily in the year 250 and was venerated at Milan, Rome, and Ravenna, and also in the East. Although the account of her martyrdom is of little historical value, it was the source for the antiphons and responsorials in the former breviary. The cult of St. Agatha is very ancient. A church was constructed in her honor at Rome in the 5th century, and at the beginning of the 6th century, Pope Symmachus introduced her feast into the liturgy at Rome and dedicated a basilica in her honor. The inclusion of her name in the Roman canon of the Mass is attributed to St. Gregory the Great. The devotion of numerous popes to St. Agatha is possibly based on the legend that St. Peter appeared to her to console her and heal her. She had been tortured on the rack and her breasts had been cut off. A few days later, she was rolled naked over burning coals. Her last prayer to Christ was, "Receive my soul," after which she breathed her last. It is believed that through St. Agatha's intercession, Sicily was miraculously saved from an eruption of Mount Etna. Consequently, she is invoked against any outbreak of fire. The opening prayer of the Mass is taken from the two prayers contained in the Gregorian Sacramentary, and it emphasizes the glory associated with virginity and martyrdom. Martyrdom reveals the power of God that triumphs over the weakness of creatures through the operation of the gifts of fortitude. The merit of chastity derives from the cooperation of the individual person with the grace of God. The Office of Readings is taken from the homily by St. Methodius, a native of Sicily and patriarch of Constantinople. He describes St. Agatha as a bride and a virgin. To use the analogy of St. Paul, she is the bride who has been betrothed to one husband, Christ. A true virgin, she wore the glow of a pure conscience and the crimson of the Lamb's blood for her cosmetics. In the same homily, St. Methodius says, Agatha, the name of our saint, means good. Agatha, her goodness, coincides with her name and way of life. She won a good name by her noble deeds, and by her name she points to the nobility of those deeds. Agatha, her mere name, wins over all people over to her company. She teaches them by her example to hasten with her to the true good, God alone. In the face of the modern sexual revolution, this feast has special significance in stressing the importance of the virtue of chastity for every state of life. This is readily seen in the unbloody martyrdom of consecrated virginity, which is especially meritorious. However, all Christians, even if they are married, should practice chastity in accordance with their condition and state of life. Finally, as in the Middle Ages, St. Agatha should be invoked by those women who are suffering from the diseases of the breast. The opening prayer states, Lord, let your forgiveness be won for us by the pleading of St. Agatha, who found favor with you by her chastity and by her courage in suffering death for the gospel. For Wineskins, I'm Lou Jacquet.
Welcome to our segment called Year of Faith, celebrating the 16 documents of the Second Vatican Council. I'm Father Jim Korda.
And I'm Father Jeffrey Mickler of the Society of St. Paul.
And the document we're going to discuss today is a decree on the adaptation and renewal of religious life.
This decree sent shock waves through the church. Now, most Catholics don't really understand what religious life is about. And they know that there are nuns that would teach in schools or hospitals. They wouldn't understand there was an infinite variety of nuns. They would know there'd be priests that are in religious congregations and orders or brothers, but they wouldn't know how to distinguish them from diocesan priests. They're all sort of lumped together. And yet there are these institutions, ancient and modern, that make up religious communities, each with their own spirituality, each with their own mission and purpose in the life of the church.
We know that there's one word that really defines religious life in the church today, and that's the word charism. How important is that word, and what is that all about?
Well, it started really with this document where the various religious congregations of men and women were challenged to get back to the roots of their foundation, to renew themselves in the charism, the original vision of their founders or foundresses, and to bring a new dynamism to their congregations. And to figure out what was essential and non-essential, especially in congregations that were hundreds of years old, would take a lot of work, a lot of reflection. My own congregation was only founded in 1914, and our founder was at the Vatican Council, so we could just ask him what he was all about. But this document wanted people to get back to their roots in order to strengthen their mission, whatever that might be.
What I'm wondering is, why would the Vatican Council have an entire document on religious life? Why is that important?
Because religious life has been really at the forefront of all of the charitable works within the church, and also at the forefront of the contemplative field, because there are some contemplative orders that from the perspective of the world don't do a thing. Just a bunch of nuns lock themselves away and Lord knows what they're doing all day. And the same would say like the Trappist monks who would be working and praying in silence, and the world could have no concept of that. But we know from the perspective of faith just how powerful those vocations are. And so the church had a desire to renew those institutions and allow them, I would say, to renew themselves following their own path. And that was at the basis of this document.
Let's talk about monasticism, because obviously that's an important part of the beginnings of religious life. What exactly are we talking about when we say the word monastic?
Well, it started in the late 4th century, early 5th century, when people looking for perfect union with God went out to the desert to pray, to be alone with God. But that loneliness with God drove most of them crazy. It did not help. And so starting with, say, like St. Benedict, they would come together in groups of men or groups of women who would pray and work together, supporting one another in this quest for the holy. St. Benedict, when he was praying one day, was wondering, well, really, what's my life about? And suddenly he had this inspiration saying, you're hiding in the face of God. And so we need those institutions, and they've stood the test of time. They really saved civilization in the West. They became centers of learning, of culture, of education. And they strengthened humanity intellectually as well as spiritually. Then in the Middle Ages, we had the mendicant orders like the Franciscans and the Dominicans start up, each with their own charism, their own mandate. And after that, there's been so many active orders meeting various needs of the church that the bishops felt we need to really address this great grace that we have.
What's interesting is that when we look at the structure of the church and the hierarchical structure, for example, bishops, priests, deacons, we know that religious life is not among those particular hierarchical structures, and yet religious life is really an important gift to the church. And how important is it for us to recognize and to always lift up religious life?
Well, there are some religious communities that are attached directly to the bishop. There are other religious congregations, like my own, that are pontifical. They're attached directly to the Pope. And others are independent because of their great antiquity. But all of them work in conjunction with the local church and the universal church. The independence of these organizations has given them their own particular vitality to seize the initiative that needs to be taken to meet the needs of God's people. And it's from these congregations the great universities have arisen, great hospitals, and we are so grateful for those lives that were dedicated and consecrating to bringing us these other great and healing and helpful institutions.
Many religious communities, at least I know here locally, have groups of people, like lay people, for example, that participate in their mission. They don't become a religious sister or brother or priest, but they participate in a very real and profound way. How has that changed in the life of the church?
Well, the life of the laity as a whole has been endorsed in the Second Vatican Council. And the consecrated life of the laity in a special way in what they call secular institutes attached to religious communities has been extremely helpful. In fact, the secular institutes are not secular in a sense that we use it in general, worldly, but they're institutes in the world to transform the world. And then there are other people that are simply volunteers and supporters of the local religious communities. And they've been so dynamic and helpful in our congregations, whatever the congregation's mission might be.
Do we have religious communities that have drastically changed in and of themselves since this document?
Yes, they've been tremendous changes exteriorly in the way people dress and the way people look, and interiorly the way the congregations are organized. And both were important because although there were many wonderful things in the pre-Vatican II living of religious life, there were also things that had to be changed, and the church knew it very profoundly.
Father Jeff, just a few brief comments as we conclude.
Religious life has always been a part of the church, will continue to be a part of the church, and will take on vital new forms under the power of the Holy Spirit.
For Wineskins, I'm Father Jim Korda.
And I'm Father Jeffrey Mickler of the Society of St. Paul.
For more information and to listen to Wineskins, visit the website of the Catholic Diocese of Youngstown at www.doi.org. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment.
33 million Americans have descended into poverty. And as their futures fall, so does our nation's.
The song we have for you today is from the CD called Miss D and Joni, Songs for a Better World. It is by local artists Diane Drapcho and Steve Vuich.
On my back, here we are, have we quickly, I think we've gotten off track. I was told I'd never have to make my bed, push a button and a robot would do all that. TV said I'd have an X-ray laser beam in my head. If I even looked at you, you'd get a super zap. But here we are. I've got no flying car. Here we are. No robot makes my bed. Yes, here we are. Have we really come so far? By now I thought we'd be further ahead. Need a new visionary like Leonardo da Vinci. Need a new visionary, perhaps like Marie Curie. Need a new visionary, someone brilliant like Annie Easley. Need a new visionary, someone who can really see, someone like Tim Berners-Lee. Need a new visionary like Leonardo da Vinci. Need a new visionary to help us like Marie Curie. Need a new visionary to solve our problems like Annie Easley. Need a new visionary, someone like Tim Berners-Lee. Oh, Sir Timothy, oh yeah, he could really see into the future. Will it be you? Possibly.
And to tell us about the scriptures for this feast of the presentation of the Lord is Father John Sheridan. He is rector of the Basilica of St. John the Baptist and pastor of St. Peter Church, both in Canton.
On the 40th day following his birth, as was the custom in the Jewish tradition, Jesus was presented by Joseph and Mary in the temple of the Lord. As they brought him into the temple, they presented the gift of the poor, 2 turtle doves or young pigeons. As we read this account of the presentation of the Lord, what strikes us is the great longing for the Lord in the hearts of the elderly Simeon and Anna. Simeon, we are told, was awaiting the consolation of Israel, which the Lord had promised he would see before his death. Anna, the prophetess who was advanced in years, spent her life at the temple of the Lord in fasting and prayer, awaiting the redemption of Israel. To these souls who waited for the Lord, he comes. His presentation in the temple in Jerusalem is seen in the Christian tradition as the fulfillment of the prophecy from Malachi that we hear in the first reading today. And suddenly there will come to the temple the Lord whom you seek, and the messenger of the covenant whom you desire. Yes, he is coming. This prophecy underlies that the great desire and longing that the people felt as they waited for the coming of the Messiah. And now, as we celebrate his presentation in the temple, we see that the Lord has come to renew their hope and to fulfill his promises. Simeon recognizes the great gift that he is given, as he calls out to the Lord in prayer. Now, Master, you may let your servant go in peace, according to your word. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you prepared in the sight of all the peoples, a light for revelation to the Gentiles, and glory for your people Israel. Simeon acknowledges that the gift of salvation is not offered only to him, nor only for the people of Israel. The salvation from our God is offered to all the world. He speaks of this as a light of revelation, that which scatters the darkness of error and sin. Jesus Christ brings with him light and glory. Only he can satisfy the longings and the deep desires of our hearts. Only he can bring true salvation and peace to the people of the world. As their encounter with the infant Lord filled them with joy and peace, and brought their weary hearts to light, so too our encounters with God fill us up with joy and bring us peace. He gives us strength in the face of weariness, and gives us the grace we need to endure every trial. Isaiah the prophet has said it well. Those who wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They will soar on eagle's wings. They will run and not grow weary, walk and not grow faint. In the same way that Simeon and Anna spent their lives in longing for the Lord, not in weariness, but in hope, we wait for the Lord. We place our trust in him and seek for him, who is the light of revelation to the Gentiles, and the glory of his people Israel. For Wineskins, I'm Father John Sheridan.
God has designed amazing things for us out of the commonplace. A young husband and his wife came to the temple that day with their child. There they met two senior citizens who were the first to recognize the Messiah. They offered a pair of turtle doves and two young pigeons. Thanks be to God. Wineskins is made possible through the annual Bishop's Appeal, the Catholic Communication Campaign, and St. Paul's Catholic Books and Gifts. The program is produced by CTNY, the Catholic Telecommunications Network of Youngstown. I'm Father Jim Korda, saying thank you for being with us. Have a blessed week. And today, we at CTNY want to express our thanks and gratitude for the women and men religious who have served and are serving in the Diocese of Youngstown.
What have you done for your marriage today?
I gave my wife a hug this morning. I told her I love her.
I did her hair this morning. I think it looks pretty good.
I cooked my husband's favorite breakfast.
I bought her an orchid.
What have I done for my marriage today? I sent my husband a love email.
I read the newspaper to my wife, and it cracked her up. But she's still laughing.
What have you done for your marriage today? Make a change for the better. Need help? Go to foryourmarriage.org, a message from the Catholic Church.
They say America is the land of opportunity, but for some, life isn't so easy. Right now in America, 1 in 6 children lives below the poverty line. That's nearly 13 million children of all races, all across our country. Where do you draw the line and get involved? You can make a difference in more ways than you think. Go to povertyusa.org today, because 1 in 6 children in poverty is one too many. A message from the Catholic Campaign for Human Development.